Hello, in this lecture we're going to continue our discussion of production and cost analysis, chapter 11. Remember, our objectives will be to explain the role of the firm in economic analysis, describe the production process in the short run, calculate fixed cost, variable cost, marginal cost, total cost, average fixed cost, average variable cost, and average total cost. We'll start to define these in this lecture, distinguish the various cost curves, and describe the relationship among them. So first we're going to define some of these terms. Now, of course, we're going to get into a lot of terms. A lot of this can get a little bit wonky after a while because we will be defining terms and we will be discussing them mathematically and looking at some equations for them. So you might want to take this up and take it in pieces. They do make sense. They're not really complicated math or anything like that, but it does take some time to think through these things in terms of just the formula, and then think in terms of the graph, think of it in terms of a table, and then it'll start to pull together and make more sense. So we're going to start off with fixed costs. Fixed costs are those that are spent and cannot be changed in the period of time under consideration. So when we think about that, we're going to say in the long run, there's no such thing as a fixed cost. In the short run, we have fixed costs. What does that mean? Well, the most common fixed cost I generally think of is like the rent. If we think about the rent, we have a contract. The contract is in place. If we have a 5-year contract, we're pretty much locked into paying that rent whenever we pay it, monthly or yearly by contract, and there's nothing we can really do about it in that time period. Therefore, that's a fixed cost. So we're going to say it is what it is at that time. We know we have to pay it. We have to pay it. There's not much we can do about it in the short run. Therefore, when we make decisions, we're going to have to pay the rent. However, if we have a long run decision that's over the 5-year period, then we can make decisions in terms of not continuing the rent or something like that, and we don't have the short run problem of fixed costs. Therefore, the fixed costs in the short run will differ, meaning our decision-making process will have to differ in the short run because of the difference in character of costs. So workers are an example of variable costs, which are costs that change as output changes. So variable costs are going to change along with production. So as we produce more things, the variable costs will change with production. If we think about workers in terms of we produce units of things, and if we hire people on an hourly basis, and we have the ability to increase or decrease hours depending on how many things we want to produce, then of course those workers would be a variable cost, because as we produce more units, we'll need more workers, and we will then hire more workers who we will pay on an hourly basis. If on the other hand, we're thinking about wages, which are going to be a fixed unit, that those aren't going to be basically variable costs. So salaries and stuff like that for like, executive staffs or supervisors and stuff, not usually variable. But if we think about an hourly unit of work, we're paying hourly in order to generate the units, then that will be variable. Obviously, things like material are going to be variable as well. Notice the difference in the way the cost behavior happens is that if we make another unit, then the amount of hours we need to produce that unit will go up at a given rate, and therefore the variable cost will change at a constant rate. They'll go up at a constant rate as we produce more stuff. So the sum of the variable and fixed costs are total costs. So there's nothing really tricky about this. Again, we're getting all these formulas that look kind of complicated here because we're putting all these letters in place. But notice what we're saying is total cost is just what we expended, whatever that total cost is. We're going to break total cost into two components based on the behavior of those costs, meaning we're going to break it out in terms of the fixed portion, the things that stay constant no matter how many things we produce, like the rent, and the variable portion, the things that change in relation to how many things we produce. Why do we do this? Because when we make decisions in the short run, which would be in this case because we have these fixed costs in the short run and we do not have them in the long run, then a lot of times we need to say, hey, we need to make the decision based on what we can control. And sometimes we can't control the fixed costs, therefore we need to take that into consideration when we're making our decision. We oftentimes need to basically take off the fixed costs in order to make a reasonable decision in the short run. Average costs. Average costs equal fixed cost divided by the quantity produced. So if we think about the average cost, obviously the average is going to be whatever the cost is divided, in this case, by the number of quantities. So average fixed cost per quantity of things we produce. So if we're producing like guitars, then we're going to take the fixed cost, things like the rent, divided by the number of guitars, and that'll give us our fixed cost per unit of guitar. if we think about what that will look like just real quickly, and how this will differ from the variable costs, then if you think about something like the rent, and say we pay $10,000 a month on rent in the factory, then if we made one guitar, we would take the 10,000 divided by the one guitar, and then we would have 10,000 per guitar, which seems kind of ridiculous when we think about it, because obviously we're not in production too much right there. We just made the one guitar, and that seems like a lot of fixed cost to allocate to one guitar. If we then produce more towards capacity, obviously if we make two guitars, then we're going to say, okay, well, it's 10,000 divided by 2. The fixed cost per guitar went way down to 500 now. And as we produce more units, note that the fixed costs will go down per unit. And so in terms of allocating the fixed costs, we would like to be producing at capacity of the warehouse if we're thinking about rent, because that brings down the fixed cost per unit. On the other hand, look at the difference in behavior if we talk about a average variable cost, which equals the variable cost divided by the quantity produced. So if we thought about all the variable costs, remember we thought, the hourly wage workers per people working hourly on the guitars we produce, and things like the material. If we think about the wood that goes into each guitar, it goes up at a constant rate as we make more guitars. Therefore, if we take the total variable cost divided by the quantity, we will come up with the average cost per unit. Note that no matter how many guitars we make, if those variable costs are constant, then we will come up with the same variable cost per unit. Why? Because if we break this out, we're going to say, well, how many dollars does it take to produce a guitar in terms of wages, in terms of material, and all other variable costs, which go up in proportion to each guitar. So we know that if we're talking about variable costs, they behave differently in that instead of having just a fixed sum like the rent, we're going to pay $10,000 no matter how many guitars we make, the variable costs go up in a relation to how many guitars we make. So that difference in behavior, the difference between how fixed costs behave and how variable costs behave, is why we need to break those two out, because it'll change how we make decisions. So then we've got the average total cost. So the average total cost equals the total cost divided by the quantity produced. So if we take the average total cost, remember we're just talking about the total cost as all the cost, and we broke those costs into two things, being the fixed cost and the variable cost. Therefore, if we just take the total cost divided by the number of quantities we produce, that would be the average total cost that we would have. Or, since we have already calculated the two components of average total cost in terms of average fixed cost and average variable cost, we could also just add those two up. We can add up the average fixed cost, the average variable cost. That will equal to the total cost. All right, let's move on to marginal cost. So we have marginal cost. And now marginal cost, remember when we're an economist, we're always thinking about this word margin means we're going to make the decision on the margin, meaning we're making the decision as to what we should do next. We are already here. Should we produce another unit? Meaning, what's going to be the marginal change? Are we going to have a positive marginal change on the margin of the next unit? So remember, when we make decisions, we're not always making them in terms of the entire range of options. We're already at a certain option, and the question is, should we go to the next step up and produce more? Should we go to the next step down? The decision is always made at the margin. So when we think of marginal cost, is the increase in the total cost when output increases 1 unit. So we're thinking about the change, that triangle of course is the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. So we're comparing, okay, if we take one more unit, how much more total cost, including the fixed cost and variable cost, compared to the next unit. The change in units in that case would be 1. So that would be our marginal cost going forward.